the wife of Bath, a medieval feminist, or a satirical stock character? The wife of Bath is one of the most famous of Chaucer's pilgrims of the Canterbury Tale. But there are arguments in the academic community about the role that her character plays in the larger context of the complete work. Some scholars argue that the wife of Bath, who reveals her name to be Alison in her prologue, is a literary example of feminism. Others say that Alison is the exact opposite, that she is a demonized, stereotypical, satirical stock character created to mock pro-feminist values. So which is it? First, we need to examine what we know about the wife of Bath. We know that her name is Alison and that she has been married 5 times. She states that her first marriage occurred when she was only 12 years old. This was considered young even at the time. It was the absolute youngest age at which a girl could be married. For this reason, Alison establishes herself as an expert on marriage, not only due to the plurality of her marriages, but also the mere fact that she's been married most of her life. We also know that Alison learned the tricks to capture a husband from her mother. And just as Alison's mother gave her advice, Alison states that she is giving advice to other wives on how to gain the upper hand in marriage. Now let's look at the arguments that scholars use to categorize the wife of Bath as a feminist. Firstly, Alison begins by stating that she's received a lot of criticism from others for having been married many times. Most critics use the Bible and religion to judge her. Alison does not appear to be bothered by this at all, because she has her own slightly unorthodox reading of the Bible. Alison points out that many of the great ancient kings of the Bible, like David and Solomon, had many wives, and yet no one said that was wrong. Alison also points out that the book of Genesis, in which God created the world, commands that we multiply, and she is more than happy to do that. To further Alison's argument in favor of marriage, Alison asks how religious scholars can deem virginity to be ideal when virgins cannot be born without their parents having had sex. She then asks what genitals are for if not for procreation and sex. And those very churchmen who make those arguments are supposed to be virgins themselves, so how could they judge sex in the first place? The wife of Bath has justified her multiple marriages with these arguments about religion and nature, but there are also other feminist motifs in her biography. For example, Alison gained land, wealth, and social standing through her marriages. In a time when women could not own property in their own right, this was a remarkable occurrence. It was the only way in which a woman, such as herself, could own anything. Alison is also unrepentantly sexual. Rather than being ashamed of her sexuality, she's proud of it and has even used it to her own advantage as a weapon against men. And finally, Alison, the 5-time wife of Bath, also made sure to assert herself as the dominant partner in her marriages. When she was assured of her place in the running of the estate, she states that she made her husbands very happy. So what are the arguments for Alison being an anti-feminist stock character? One is Alison's overall personality. Alison is depicted as being heretical and rather bawdy. She is loud, opinionated, and openly admits to putting her own experiences above the Bible. This was quite unthinkable and unseemly at the time. Alison has also been married 5 times. She says that 3 of her husbands were good because they were old and rich, and 2 were bad because they were young and harder to control. Her 4th husband had a mistress, which to her was bad enough, but her 5th husband was an abusive man who she ironically claims to have loved most of all. This is hardly modern feminist talk, both because of the number of times she symbolically submitted to the patriarchal structure through marriage, but also due to her acceptance of abuse. Alison's behavior in marriage was also hardly an ideal argument in any relationship. Alison admits to being nagging and manipulative. She readily lied to, yelled at, and withheld sex from her husbands to get her own way. It wasn't until she felt her husbands were completely under her control that she would relent her purgatory, as she called it. This behavior is now seen as abusive and unacceptable from anyone toward anyone. But it's also an example of the exaggerated fear of men. By painting Allison as being an abusive, controlling wife, Chaucer creates the perfect embodiment of what men fear most, and that is a woman being as powerful as a man. Is there a rebuttal to the anti-feminist argument? Well, of course. Allison is sex positive, which in the medieval period was unspeakable, but is quite celebrated today. Her greed and perceived selfishness, as depicted through her own descriptions of her enactments in marriage, and exacerbated by her abusive and manipulative actions, could also be viewed as a move towards independence and autonomy at a time in which women could not gain either in any way but marriage. It is also noteworthy to point out a second time that her characterization as an atrocious, manipulative, sex-crazed woman highlighted the fear of men losing their control over women. Finally, it is also important to point out that until quite recently, marriage was not about love and equal partnership. Marriage had been about business and family connections for centuries before our modern conception of marriage for love. To Allison, that she played very well. In conclusion, is Allison a feminist icon or a satirical stock character? Well, the short answer is that she's both. Regardless of Chaucer's intent when creating her, Allison has become both the embodiment of men's fears as well as an example of a woman who plays her cards to her own advantage. She is loud, bawdy, manipulative gossip, but she is also a shrewd, calculating businesswoman. She knew what she wanted and used any tool at her disposal to get it. In a world in which men would be praised for their relentless and merciless pursuit for power and dominance, she was a woman who withstood criticism and demonization for doing the exact same thing. The wife of Bath is a stock character who not only embodied the stereotypical evil woman that her fifth husband loved to read about, but she also served as a precursor to the nagging wife trope still used today.